The sun blazed mercilessly overhead as 17-year-old Marcus Rodriguez adjusted the pool skimmer for what felt like the 100th time that morning. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the early hour, and he could already feel the humid, Texas heat promising another scorching July day. Today wasn't just any Saturday, it was the day he'd been planning for 3 months, ever since his parents had reluctantly agreed to let him throw his graduation party while they visited his grandmother in San Antonio. This is going to be epic, Marcus muttered to himself, surveying the backyard that had been transformed into a teenage paradise. Colorful streamers fluttered between the oak trees. A borrowed sound system sat strategically positioned near the pool deck, and coolers filled with sodas and snacks lined the patio. His older sister Carmen had even helped him string up fairy lights that would create the perfect ambiance once the sun set. Marcus pulled out his phone, scrolling through the group chat that had been buzzing nonstop for the past week. 37. People had confirmed they were coming, not too many to get out of hand, but enough to make it a memorable celebration. His best friend Jake was bringing his portable speakers, Sophia promised to make her famous guacamole, and even Quiet Emma from his AP literature class had said she'd try to make it. The only cloud on his horizon was the house directly next door. Mrs. Henderson, or Karen, as she'd become known throughout the neighborhood, had already made her feelings crystal clear about the upcoming festivities. Just yesterday, she'd cornered him while he was checking the mail, her thin lips pursed in that familiar expression of disapproval. "I hope you're not planning anything too loud or disruptive," she'd said, her arms crossed tightly over her floral blouse. "Some of us value peace and quiet in our neighborhood. I've lived here for 15 years, young man, and I won't tolerate any nonsense." Marcus had assured her it would be a small, respectful gathering, but the way her eyes had narrowed suggested she wasn't convinced. Mrs. Henderson was notorious on Maple Street for her complaints about everything from slightly overgrown lawns to garbage cans left out an hour too long. She'd called the city about the Patel family's beautiful garden because it attracted too many bees, and had tried to get the Johnsons' dog banned from the neighborhood park because it barked during its evening walks. But Marcus wasn't going to let one bitter neighbor ruin his celebration. He'd worked 2 part-time jobs all senior year to save money for college, maintained a 3.8 GPA, and had been accepted to his dream school with a partial scholarship. If anyone deserved to celebrate, it was him. By 11 a.m., the first guests began, arriving. Jake showed up with his signature backwards baseball cap and a grin that could light up the whole block, immediately diving into setting up the music system. Sophia arrived with not just guacamole, but also homemade salsa and her infectious laugh that made everyone feel welcome. Soon, the backyard was filled with the happy chatter of teenagers catching up, sharing summer plans, and enjoying the freedom that came with finally being done with high school. The pool became the natural center of activity. Crystal clear water sparkled invitingly under the sun, and it wasn't long before the first brave souls were cannonballing off the diving board, sending up sprays of cool water that felt like heaven in the oppressive heat. Marcus felt his chest swell with pride as he watched his friends having the time of their lives. This was exactly what he had envisioned. A perfect day to mark the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Emma surprised everyone by showing up in a bright red bikini that was completely different from her usual conservative style. And she was one of the first to jump in the pool, emerging with a huge smile and her usually perfect hair dripping wet. "This is amazing, Marcus," she called out, treading water near the shallow end. "Thank you for inviting me." The music pumped at a reasonable volume. Marcus had been careful about that, knowing Mrs. Henderson would be listening for any excuse to complain. Classic summer hits mixed with current pop favorites created the perfect soundtrack for cannonballs, pool volleyball, and lazy floating on inflatable unicorns and flamingos that had become essential pool party accessories. But even as Marcus tried to stay relaxed and enjoy his own party, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every so often, he'd catch a glimpse of Mrs. Henderson's curtains twitching in her kitchen window, which had a perfect view of their pool area. Her presence felt like a storm cloud hovering over their sunny day, and Marcus found himself constantly checking the time and monitoring the noise level, even though everything was perfectly reasonable. Around 1 p.m., things were in full swing. About 25 kids were scattered around the backyard and pool area, some swimming, others playing cornhole on the grass, and a few sitting in the shade sharing stories and laughing. The volume was well within neighborhood guidelines. Marcus had specifically researched the local ordinances to make sure he stayed within legal limits. But despite his precautions, he noticed Mrs. Henderson had emerged from her house and was standing in her backyard, arms crossed, staring directly at their gathering with an expression that could curdle milk. "Dude, your neighbor looks like she wants to murder someone," Jake observed, following Marcus's gaze. "What's her deal?" "She's just particular about noise," Marcus replied diplomatically, though his stomach was beginning to knot with anxiety. "I'm sure she'll get used to it. We're not doing anything wrong." Famous last words, as it turned out. At exactly 1:47 p.m., Marcus would remember the time forever because he just checked his phone to see a text from his parents asking how the party was going. Mrs. Henderson marched across her perfectly manicured lawn, through the gate separating their properties, and straight toward the pool area where Marcus was helping his friend Tyler fix a deflated pool float. "Excuse me," she called out in a voice sharp enough to cut glass, causing conversations to halt and heads to turn. "Excuse me!" Marcus felt every eye in the backyard shift to him as Mrs. Henderson approached, her face flushed red with what appeared to be righteous indignation. She was wearing the same floral blouse from yesterday, paired with khaki pants that looked like they'd been pressed with military precision, and her gray hair was pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch her features. "Mrs. Henderson," Marcus said, trying to keep his voice calm and respectful, despite the way his heart had started racing. "Is everything okay?" "Everything is not okay, young man," she snapped, her voice carrying across the suddenly quiet backyard. This circus you've created is completely unacceptable. The noise, the chaos, the complete disregard for your neighbors. I've had enough." Marcus glanced around at his friends, who were all staring with a mixture of confusion and barely suppressed amusement. The chaos she was referring to consisted of some splashing in the pool, quiet conversations, and music that was barely audible beyond their property line. "I'm sorry if we're disturbing you," Marcus said carefully. "But we're well within the noise ordinances for the city. I checked before." "Don't you dare lecture me about ordinances," Mrs. Henderson interrupted, taking another step closer. Her eyes were blazing with an anger that seemed completely disproportionate to the situation. "I don't care what some piece of paper says. This is a residential neighborhood, not some spring break destination." The comparison was so absurd that Marcus heard Jake snort with laughter behind him, which only seemed to inflame Mrs. Henderson further. "You think this is funny?" She whirled toward Jake, who immediately tried to compose his features. "You children have no respect, no consideration for others, swimming and screaming and carrying on like animals." The word animals hung in the air like a slap, and Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach. Several of his friends were Latino, Black, and Asian, and the way Mrs. Henderson had said animals while looking directly at them made the implication clear. This wasn't just about noise complaints. "Mrs. Henderson," Marcus said, his voice harder now, "I think you should go back to your house. We're not doing anything wrong, and we have every right to use our own backyard." "Your rights?" She laughed, a harsh sound that made everyone uncomfortable. "What about my rights? My right to peace and quiet. My right to enjoy my property without being subjected to this urban nonsense?" There it was. The barely concealed racism that Marcus had suspected lurked beneath her complaints about noise and disruption. The way she'd emphasized urban made several of his friends exchange meaningful glances, and Marcus felt his face grow hot with anger and embarrassment. "That's enough," he said firmly, standing up to his full height. At 6'2", he towered over the petite woman, but she didn't back down an inch. "Oh, now you're trying to intimidate me?" Mrs. Henderson's voice rose to a near shriek. "A young thug trying to intimidate a defenseless woman? I see exactly what this is." "Nobody's intimidating anyone," Emma called out from the pool, her voice steady despite the tension. "We're just trying to have a nice graduation party." Mrs. Henderson's head snapped toward Emma, and her expression grew even more venomous. "And you should be ashamed of yourself, young lady, running around half-naked encouraging this kind of behavior. What would your parents think?" The slut-shaming was the final straw. Marcus felt his temper, which he'd been holding in check throw. The 15 minutes that followed Mrs. Henderson's phone call felt like an eternity suspended in thick summer air. Marcus watched helplessly as his friends began gathering their belongings, the joyful energy of the party dissolving into nervous whispers and uncertain glances. Some of the younger kids looked genuinely scared. For many of them, this would be their first encounter with police, and Mrs. Henderson's theatrical performance had painted them all as dangerous criminals. "Maybe we should just leave," whispered Aisha, Marcus's lab partner from chemistry class. She was clutching her towel around herself like armor, her usual confidence completely shattered. "I don't want my parents finding out I got in trouble with the police." "Nobody's in trouble," Marcus insisted, though his own voice carried less conviction than he'd hoped. "We haven't done anything wrong. This is insane." But even as he spoke, Marcus could see the doubt creeping into his friends' faces. They all knew stories, everyone did these days, about innocent situations that had spiraled out of control when police arrived. The fact that most of his guest list consisted of teenagers of color only added another layer of anxiety to an already volatile situation. Jake, ever the loyal friend, moved to stand beside Marcus in a show of solidarity. "This is bullshit," he said loudly enough for Mrs. Henderson to hear. "She can't just lie to the cops and ruin our day because she's a racist." "Jake, don't," Marcus warned, noticing how Mrs. Henderson's eyes lit up at the word racist. He could practically see her filing it away as more ammunition for her victim. Narrative. The sound of approaching sirens cut through the summer afternoon like a knife, and Marcus felt his stomach drop to somewhere around his ankles. This was really happening. Police were actually coming to his house because a neighbor didn't like the sound of teenagers having fun in a swimming pool. What happened next, however, was something none of them, including Mrs. Henderson, had anticipated. The first officer to step out of the patrol car was a familiar face that made Marcus do a double take. Officer Carmen Rodriguez, his older sister's best friend from high school and practically a member of their family, emerged from the driver's seat with an expression of barely contained confusion. Behind her came a younger officer Marcus didn't recognize, a tall black man who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else on a Saturday afternoon. "Marcus?" Officer Rodriguez called out, her eyebrows nearly disappearing into her hairline. "What in the world is going on here?" Before Marcus could answer, Mrs. Henderson rushed forward, her phone still recording everything. "Officer, thank goodness you're here. This young man has been threatening me, and his gang has been creating a public disturbance all day." "Officer Rodriguez." Carmen had always insisted Marcus call her by her first name, but the uniform changed things. Looked from Mrs. Henderson to Marcus and back again with an expression that suggested she was trying to solve a particularly ridiculous puzzle. "Ma'am," she said carefully, "I'm going to need you to slow down and explain exactly what happened, and please put your phone away. We're not performing for social media." Mrs. Henderson's face flushed even redder. "I most certainly will not. I have every right to document this harassment. These people have been making excessive noise, playing inappropriate music, and when I politely asked them to quiet down, he threatened me." The second officer, whose name tag read Williams, was meanwhile taking in the scene with obvious bewilderment. A dozen teenagers stood around a pristine backyard pool, some still dripping wet, all looking like deer caught in headlights. Empty soda cans and paper plates suggested nothing more sinister than a typical summer gathering. The music system was currently silent, and the only disturbance was Mrs. Henderson herself, who was still gesticulating wildly while she spoke. "What kind of threats were made?" Officer Rodriguez asked, pulling out her notepad with professional efficiency. "He told me to get off the property, in a very aggressive tone, and then all his friends started surrounding me." Marcus opened his mouth to protest, but Officer Rodriguez held up a hand that told him to wait his turn. She'd clearly dealt with enough false reports to know how these things usually went. "Were you on their property when this alleged threat occurred?" she asked Mrs. Henderson. "Well, that's not the point. The point is, ma'am, it's a simple question. Were you on their property?" Mrs. Henderson's mouth opened and closed, like a fish out of water. "I was simply trying to reason with them as a neighbor." "On their property," Officer Rodriguez stated flatly. So you entered their backyard uninvited, confronted a group of minors, and when the homeowner asked you to leave, you considered that a threat. It wasn't what he said, it was how he said it. Very aggressive and intimidating. Officer Williams had been quietly walking around the pool area, taking note of the decorations, the small coolers filled with sodas, and the complete absence of anything that could remotely be considered illegal or problematic. He returned to his partner with a slight shake of his head. "Ma'am," Officer Rodriguez continued, "I've known Marcus Rodriguez since he was 12 years old. He's never been in any kind of trouble. He volunteers at the community center, and he's graduating as valedictorian of his class. Are you seriously telling me that you believe he's running some kind of criminal operation out of his backyard pool?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and for the first time since this whole ordeal began, Mrs. Henderson seemed to realize that her narrative wasn't playing out the way she'd expected. But what happened next shocked everyone, including the officers. "You people always stick together, don't you?" Mrs. Henderson spat, her mask of concerned citizen finally slipping completely. "Of course you'd take his side. You're probably related. Can't trust any of you to do your jobs properly when it comes to your own kind." The silence that followed was deafening. Officer Rodriguez's face went stone cold, and Officer Williams actually took a step back, clearly stunned by the blatant racism he'd just witnessed. "Ma'am," Officer Rodriguez said, her voice deadly quiet, "I'm going to need you to repeat what you just said." Mrs. Henderson seemed to realize she'd crossed a line, but rather than backing down, she doubled down. "I said what I said. This whole neighborhood has gone downhill since certain types started moving in. Property values dropping, noise increasing, no respect for established residents." "That's enough," Officer Williams interjected sharply. "Ma'am, you need to stop talking right now." But Mrs. Henderson was on a roll, apparently believing that her whiteness and homeowner status gave her carte blanche to say whatever she wanted. "I pay taxes in this community. I've been here for 15 years. I shouldn't have to put up with this urban element bringing down the whole area." Marcus felt like he was watching a train wreck in slow motion. Part of him was horrified by the naked bigotry on display, but another part was almost relieved that Mrs. Henderson was finally showing her true colors in front of witnesses who couldn't be dismissed or ignored. Officer Rodriguez was clearly struggling to maintain her professional composure. "Ma'am, I'm going to strongly advise you to return to your home before this situation escalates further." "Escalates?" Mrs. Henderson laughed shrilly. "I'm the victim. Here. I'm being harassed by criminals and their sympathizers." That's when the second twist of the day occurred, one that no one, not even Marcus in his wildest imagination, could have predicted. A new voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Karen Henderson, what in the hell do you think you're doing?" Everyone turned to see an elderly black woman marching across the lawn with the determined stride of someone who was absolutely done with nonsense. She was probably in her 70s, impeccably dressed despite the heat, and carrying herself with the kind of dignity that commanded immediate respect. Mrs. Henderson's face went white. Mrs. Washington?" "Don't you Mrs. Washington me, young lady," the older woman said, and there was steel in her voice that made everyone stand a little straighter. "I've been watching this whole shameful display from my kitchen window, and I am disgusted. Absolutely disgusted." Marcus realized this must be Mrs. Washington from the house on the corner, the quiet woman he'd seen tending her rose garden but had never really talked to. She'd lived on Maple Street longer than anyone, and suddenly Marcus understood why Mrs. Henderson looked like she'd seen a ghost. "These are good children having a nice celebration," Mrs. Washington continued, gesturing toward Marcus and his friends. "And you're out here making a fool of yourself and embarrassing our entire neighborhood with this racist nonsense." "I'm not racist," Mrs. Henderson protested weakly. "I just want peace and quiet." "Child, please," Mrs. Washington cut her off with a wave of her hand. "I heard every word you said from my kitchen, talking about urban elements and certain types. You should be ashamed of yourself. Your own mother would roll over in her grave if she could see how you're acting." The mention of her mother seemed to hit Mrs. Henderson like a physical blow. "How dare you bring my mother into this? Your mother was Dorothy Henderson," Mrs. Washington continued relentlessly. Dorothy used to bring me casseroles when my husband was sick, and she helped me with my groceries every week until the day she died. She was a good woman who raised you better than this, and you're dishonoring her memory with the revelation that Mrs. Washington had been recording everything sent a visible shockwave through the assembled group. Mrs. Henderson's face cycled through several shades of red and white, settling on a sickly green that suggested she was beginning to understand the gravity of her situation. Officer Rodriguez and Officer Williams exchanged a look that Marcus had seen between adults before, the kind that set an entire conversation without words. "Mrs. Washington," Officer Rodriguez said carefully, "would you be willing to share that recording with us?" "Of course, dear," the elderly woman replied, her fingers moving across her smartphone with surprising dexterity. "I started recording the moment Karen marched over here like she was leading some kind of crusade. My granddaughter taught me how to use this live streaming feature, said it was important for people my age to document things when we see injustice happening." Marcus felt his heart skip a beat. "Live streaming?" Mrs. Washington nodded with a slight smile. "Oh yes, honey. This whole thing has been broadcasting on Facebook Live for the past 20 minutes. I've got about 300 people watching right now, including my church group, the neighborhood watch committee, and half the PTA from the elementary school." The color drained completely from Mrs. Henderson's face. In the age of social media, her racist rant hadn't just been witnessed by a handful of teenagers and 2 police officers. It had been broadcast live to hundreds of people in the community, creating a permanent record that could never be taken back or denied. "You can't do that!" Mrs. Henderson shrieked, lunging toward Mrs. Washington's phone. "That's illegal! You're violating my privacy!" Officer Williams stepped smoothly between them, his hand resting casually on his belt. "Ma'am, you need to step back. Mrs. Washington was on her own property recording events that were clearly visible and audible from a public space. She has every right to document what she witnessed." But this will ruin me!" Mrs. Henderson's voice cracked with desperation. "My job, my reputation, you have to make her delete it." "I'm afraid that's not how it works," Officer Rodriguez said, though Marcus could hear a note of something that might have been sympathy in her voice. "You made those statements in a public setting, in front of multiple witnesses. The recording is just documentation of what actually happened." Mrs. Washington was scrolling through the comments on her live stream, her eyebrows rising higher with each passing second. "Oh my," she murmured. "Karen, you might want to know that your employer's HR department just commented on this video, something about reviewing their social media policy and community standards." Mrs. Henderson worked as a supervisor at the local bank. Marcus knew this because she'd made a point of mentioning her important position in the financial sector during various neighborhood disputes. The thought of her co-workers and superiors watching her racist meltdown seemed to be the final straw that broke her composure entirely. "This isn't fair," she wailed, her carefully maintained facade crumbling completely. "I was just trying to protect my property values. This neighborhood used to be different." "Different how?" Mrs. Washington asked pointedly. "You mean when it was just white families? Because I've got news for you, young lady. I moved to this street in 1982, and there have always been families of all colors here. The only thing that's different now is that you've decided to show your true colors." Officer Rodriguez was taking notes, but Marcus could see she was also trying to figure out how to de-escalate a situation that had spiraled far beyond a simple noise complaint. The presence of the live stream added a layer of complexity. They couldn't just send everyone home and pretend this hadn't happened. That's when Marcus made a decision that surprised even himself. "Officer Rodriguez," he said, stepping forward, "I don't want to press charges." Everyone turned to stare at him, including his friends, who looked like they thought he'd lost his mind. "Marcus," Jake hissed, "she tried to get you arrested for having a pool party. She called you a thug." "I know," Marcus replied quietly, his eyes fixed on Mrs. Henderson, who was now openly crying. "But look at her. She's already facing consequences that are probably going to change her whole life. Her job, her reputation, her place in this community. It's all gone because she couldn't keep her racism to herself for one afternoon." Mrs. Henderson looked up at him through her tears, confusion, and something that might have been hope flickering. in her eyes. "That doesn't mean I forgive you," Marcus continued, his voice firm. "What you did today was wrong. What you said was hurtful and racist and completely unacceptable. But I'm about to start college, and I want to begin that chapter of my life focusing on building people up, not tearing them down." Officer Williams nodded approvingly. "That's very mature of you, son." "However," Marcus added, and his voice took on a harder edge, "I do want this documented. I want an official report filed about what happened here today, including Mrs. Henderson's false accusations and her racist statements. Because if she ever tries to harass me or my family again, I want there to be a paper trail." "Absolutely," Officer Rodriguez agreed, making another note. "Mrs. Henderson, you need to understand that filing a false police report is a criminal offense. The fact that Mr. Rodriguez is choosing not to press charges doesn't erase what happened here today." Mrs. Henderson nodded miserably, seeming to shrink into herself. But the day still had one more surprise in store. Mrs. Washington cleared her throat, drawing everyone's attention. "Karen, I want you to listen to me very carefully. Your mother, Dorothy, was my friend for over 30 years. When she was dying, she made me promise to look after you, to try to guide you if you ever lost your way." Mrs. Henderson's tears came, harder now, and Marcus found himself genuinely feeling sorry for her despite everything that had happened. "I've watched you become bitter and angry over the past few years," Mrs. Washington continued. "Ever since your divorce, ever since you lost that promotion at work, you've been looking for someone to blame for your unhappiness. But honey, the problem isn't the changing neighborhood. The problem is the hate that's been growing in your heart. I don't know how to fix this," Mrs. Henderson whispered. "Everyone's going to see that video. My life is over." "Your life isn't over," Mrs. Washington said firmly, "but it's going to be different. You can choose to learn from this, to grow from it, to become the woman your mother raised you to be. Or you can let the shame and anger consume you even more. That choice is yours." Marcus watched this exchange with fascination and growing respect for Mrs. Washington. She was offering Mrs. Henderson something that very few people get in life, a chance at genuine redemption, even in the midst of facing consequences for her actions. What would I have to do?" Mrs. Henderson asked hesitantly. Mrs. Washington looked thoughtful. "Well, for starters, you could apologize. A real apology, not one of those, 'I'm sorry if you were offended' non-apologies. You could acknowledge what you did wrong and commit to doing better." Mrs. Henderson looked around the group, at Marcus and his friends, at the officers, at Mrs. Washington. Marcus could see her wrestling with her pride, her shame, and perhaps for the first time, her conscience. I'm sorry," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Marcus, I'm sorry. You're a good kid, and you didn't deserve what I said or did today. Your friends didn't deserve it either. I was wrong, and I was racist. There's no excuse for it." The apology hung in the air, and Marcus found himself studying Mrs. Henderson's face, trying to determine if it was genuine or just damage control. What he saw there was exhaustion, shame, and what looked like the beginning of real remorse. "I accept your apology," he said finally. "But Mrs. Henderson, this can't happen again. Not to me, not to anyone else in this neighborhood. We all deserve to feel safe and welcome in our own homes." "I know," she nodded. I think I need help. Professional help. This isn't who I want to be." Mrs. Washington smiled for the first time since arriving. "That's the first smart thing you've said all day, child. And I know just the person, Dr. Sarah Chen at the Community Counseling Center. She specializes in helping people work through issues like this." Officer Rodriguez was finishing up her report, but Marcus could see she was also documenting this unexpected turn toward reconciliation. "Mrs. Henderson, while we're not filing criminal charges today, I want to be very clear about something. This incident will be on record. If there are any future complaints about harassment or discriminatory behavior, this will be taken into account." "I understand," Mrs. Henderson said quietly. As the officers prepared to leave, Marcus realized that his graduation party had become something completely different from what he'd planned, but maybe something more important. His friends were slowly beginning to relax again, the immediate crisis having passed, though the mood was obviously very different from the carefree celebration they'd started with. "Mrs. Washington," Marcus said as the older woman prepared to return to her house, "thank you for standing up for us, for recording everything, for giving her a chance to be better." Mrs. Washington patted his shoulder gently. "Honey, I've been watching you grow up from afar for years. You're going to do great things in this world. Today just proved it. It takes real character to show mercy when you..."